Hey everybody, hope you're having a great day today. So I got a call from my cousin and he said that he's moving down to Florida, and he asked me where should he move? Should he move to the East Coast or should he move to the West Coast of Florida? He says, what's the differences? He's not the first person to ask that question. So what I told him I was going to do is I'm going to put a list together of things that I consider different and some things that other people, and post it, because he's not the first person to ask that question. That question is asked a lot. So let's go down the list. In the meantime, if you could do me a favor, if you could subscribe, if you're not a subscriber already, hit the bell notification so you're notified. And if you like this video, do me a favor, just give it a thumbs up. All right, let's get started. The first thing, it's obvious. The East Coast is on the Atlantic side, the West Coast is on the Gulf side. The Atlantic side, the water is a lot rougher, it's deeper, and it has bigger waves. That's obvious. The Gulf side is shallower. Like, when I say shallower, I mean like pretty much for every mile you go down a foot. Like when I go out on my boat and I go 15 miles out, 16 miles out, I'll be lucky to hit 20 feet of water. So it's shallower and the water's calmer. So if you like calm water, you know, that might be where to go. If you like surfing or big waves, the East Coast is definitely much better than the West Coast when it comes to surfing. All right. So basically, the beaches on the East Coast are generally wider. So they're wider, they have a different kind of sand than the West Coast. But both sides have beautiful beaches. I think the East Coast has a more coastal line of beaches compared to the West Coast, but they both have beautiful beaches and they both have different benefits to it. So let's go over that. All right, while we're on the subject of beaches, I did a little research. The East Coast is more friendly to driving a vehicle onto the beach compared to the West Coast. So if you want to drive your vehicle onto the beach, the East Coast is better for that. And not for nothing, but I also read that the East Coast has 2, maybe 3 nude beaches. So if you want to take off all your clothes, I don't know, I didn't see any on the West Coast when I did that research, but that's important to some people. So if you want to go to a nude beach, it's most likely you'll find it on the East Coast. So another thing that I read that was interesting, people from the West Coast and the Midwest tend to migrate towards the West Coast of Florida, while people from the Northeast tend to migrate to the East Coast of Florida. Don't ask me why, and that might be changing in the future, but as of right now, it looks like the people from the West Coast and the Midwest, West Coast of Florida, and people from the Northeast like the East Coast. Fishing. This one I could talk about because I fish both sides. I fish all the way down from the Keys to the East Coast and the West Coast. And I talk to a lot of fishermen. And basically, a lot of people agree the fishing is better in the Gulf. You catch a lot of different kind of species, you know, and you can do shallow water fishing. I'm not saying you can't do this stuff on the East Coast, but overall, it seems like all the diehard fishermen, from what I understand, in my opinion, like the Gulf of Mexico fishing better than the West Coast fishing. And the water's calmer, so it's more comfortable going out. Real estate. It appears that the East Coast real estate is more expensive than the West Coast of real estate. And that's pretty much justified more because of Miami, Fort Lauderdale. I mean, those areas are super expensive to buy a house. So if you're looking for a less expensive house, you may be able to find it on the West Coast than on the East Coast, because prices tend to be cheaper on the West Coast. Because I looked at some of the prices of some of the houses near Miami. Forget about it. You're talking about some of them for 1,500 square feet. They want $1 million. So prices of homes cheaper on the West Coast, in my opinion. Let's talk about something I like about the East Coast. When I'm on the beach on the East Coast, I feel like I get this really, really nice breeze. And then when I'm on the beach on the West Coast, not as much. I'm not saying I don't get a breeze, but it really feels good on the East Coast. So I found that to be a plus for the East Coast. In return, since I spend a lot of time on the East Coast and West Coast, you cannot beat the sunset on the West Coast. If you're into watching the sunset go down, the West Coast of Florida is the place to be, because it's some of the most beautiful sunsets I've seen on the West Coast of Florida. Let's talk about traffic. Traffic is horrible on the East Coast and the West Coast, but not for nothing, it's worse on the East Coast. People might argue that, but forget about it. Especially when I'm going through Fort Lauderdale, Miami, that whole section over there is just, and going up 95, the traffic is ridiculous. So less traffic, in my opinion, is on the West Coast. So keep that in mind. If you don't want to hit traffic, keep away from the East Coast. All right, here's a big one. If you want a more laid-back atmosphere, a more relaxing, the West Coast is the place to be. It's kind of changing a little bit in some areas, like St. Pete, you know, some areas like that. But overall, East Coast is great for nightlife, partying, just having a good old time. But if you want relaxing, sitting back, watching the sunset, and not being stressed with all that stuff, it's the West Coast. The West Coast is, in my opinion, definitely more laid back than the East Coast. This next one is my opinion. The East Coast, I believe, is more prone to hurricanes than the West Coast. I'm not saying the West Coast doesn't get hit by hurricanes, because it does, but the East Coast feels in the past few years to be more prone to hurricanes than the West Coast. Obviously we have a devastating one on the West Coast last year, but it is what it is. But at the same time, the West Coast, to me, because of that breeze I talked about, is a lot hot and humid than the East Coast. So if you're not into hot and humid, I'm not saying it's not hot and humid on the East Coast, but the West Coast appears more hot and humid than the East Coast. So because the East Coast has the nicer breeze. So that's the weather part. If you're into marine life, the East Coast is known for the sea turtles, to the point that the buildings along the ocean sometimes have to shut off their lights when they lay their eggs, so they don't mess them up. The West Coast is known for manatees, you know, and there's a good amount of manatees here. And if you're a boater on the West Coast, you have to be really careful where you go, especially in shallow waters, because you can't really see the manatees. They're just below the water, and you could hit them and hurt them. So West Coast manatees, East Coast sea. Right, so in closing, basically, if you want a more party atmosphere, East Coast is for you. If you want a more laid-back atmosphere, West Coast is for you. If you like sunsets, West Coast is for you. If you like a nice cool breeze, not all the time, East Coast is for you. If you want to get away from traffic, West Coast is for you. You see where I'm going with this? So there's a lot of pros and cons on both sides, but in the meantime, just come down and check out the East Coast and West Coast. Come down 95 and then head over to the West Coast and check out everything. Go down to the Keys. It's beautiful down there. Anyways, that's today's video. Greatly appreciate it. Please, if you haven't subscribed, subscribe. hit the bell notification, and if you like the video, please give it a thumbs up, and I will talk to you on the next video. Thank you.